Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. Really pleased to have David Stockman with me once again. And David, I'm sure most of you know him, but maybe some of you younger folks are not as familiar with David as some of us older guys have been around for a few more decades, around trips around the sun. David was a U.S. congressman from Michigan in the 1980s. And he was selected by President Reagan to be his Director of Office and Management and the Budget, the Director of the Office and Management of Budget, because he was considered to be a real sharpshooter when it come to understanding the complexities of the budget at that time. I can't imagine that it's not a whole lot more complex now, and I don't think there's anybody that's half as smart as David in charge now. But in any event, David became known on the national scene in those days because of his outspokenness and his willingness to speak his mind to the President of the United States. Can you imagine that? He wasn't going to be canceled. He wasn't canceled. He might have been kicked out of office, might have been let go by the President. I don't know the details anymore, but he wasn't canceled, that's for sure, and he's remained outspoken ever since. Thank God for that. David, so thank you so much for coming on with us again today.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Jay. And now that you're talking about ancient history, I think it's first worth recalling that in January 1981, when Reagan, faced down the monster that he had inherited from Jimmy Carter, inflation was double digits, the deficit budget was out of control, the economy was falling apart. We were scared to death that the national debt might cross the $1 trillion mark on Ronald Reagan's watch. And today it's $30 trillion. We're in a totally different universe. So what was considered a crisis then might be considered a huge success today. And, I don't want to sound like the guy who says everything's going to a hell in a handbasket, but I surely think it is. And especially with respect to this, cancel culture and this rampant censorship that has come out of Silicon Valley, especially in the last few years during the COVID era. And, people being deplatformed because they were saying things that weren't consistent with the mainstream narrative. That was all bad enough, but where we are today is far worse, because not only are you being attacked for all those things, but you're also being accused of being an agent, or as I said in an article the other day, a useful idiot for Vlad Putin if you don't agree with what they're saying on CNN and NBC. That's where we are today. And I've never seen anything like this, and I did spend a good part of my career in Washington. But the place is now rabid with war fever. I don't think there's anything in history this extreme, going all the way back to the eve of the Battle of Bull Run, when all the dandies got in their carriages and rode out to the Virginia countryside wanting to get a look at how fast the rebellion was going to be put down. I mean, this is really bad. We don't need to be in this circumstance today, not simply the disaster that's happening to the Ukraine, but the fact that in response, these brilliant people in Washington have said, yeah, we know how to fix this. We'll attack the entire global economy and financial system with sanctions and exclusions and shutting down access to the SWIFT system and all the rest of it, and that'll teach the Russians a lesson. That is crazy as hell. That is going to wreck the trading system of the world, which is actually designed for a peaceful world order. It is not designed for a time of warfare, and we're seeing examples of it every day. For instance, we've had this tremendous semiconductor shortage, which we all know is the cause of many of these bottlenecks that we've been having in every kind of industry, including auto. And we find out today that a key ingredient that goes into semiconductor production is actually made, neon gas is made almost exclusively in the Ukraine, including, in fact, the factory is located in the Donbass in the eastern side, and it's shut down. Now, that's one thing. Another I saw yesterday, there was some desperate guy on Bubble Vision who was, in the international transportation business, telling people that most of the goods which go to Europe from China, and we're talking here hundreds of billions of consumer goods a year, transit through Russia by rail. And all of a sudden, the owners of those goods are not wanting to get caught with their Russian pants down by the sanctions. And so they're desperately attempting to reroute their shipments either by sea or by air. And as a result, almost overnight, prices for ocean freight have increased 3 to 5%. Not 5%, 3 to 5 times. On top of the huge eruption that occurred during the COVID era.
Yeah.
So to make it simple, it's going to cost about $40,000 to move goods in one container from China to Europe, compared to $2,000 pre-COVID 2019, before all of these different disasters descended on the system. So somehow, if they think they're actually punishing the Russians, they're out of their minds. This is going to, the second, third, and fourth order impacts of all these sanctions and disruptions of the very intricate patterns of global trade and finance. They don't have the slightest clue of what's going to happen tomorrow, the next day, and the day after. And it's going to end up punishing the American people every bit as much as it will Russia. And then the final point, of course, is that none of this is necessary. Putin has been saying for 20 years, but especially since 2008, I have a red line, and the red line is putting NATO on my doorstep, particularly Ukraine. He said, don't do it. The buck stops there. It can't happen. We ignored him. He finally put out what I thought was a pretty sensible proposal for, security guarantees in mid-December. It said 3 simple things. One, neutrality and no NATO membership for Ukraine. Nothing wrong with that. We don't need NATO, period, but we certainly don't need a 30-member NATO with another country added that's on the very doorstep of Russia. Second, he said the forward anti-missile bases near the Russian border have got to be moved back to NATO territory proper, that is West Germany or France or something. And third, all these American and German and French troops that are on his doorstep in Poland, Romania, and elsewhere need to go back to their home bases. Now, none of that would detract in one iota from the safety and security of the American homeland. None of that. That easily could have been agreed to. It could have been dickered over. But what did these arrogant people who surround Sleepy Joe Biden do? They dismissed it out of hand. They gave lectures on, the rule of law, as if of course, we've invaded 74 countries in the last 70 years, as if we're kind of a paragon of the rule of law. But in any event, and little lectures about how NATO has an open door policy. Well, in 1972 or 1962, October, I think Khrushchev implied that he had an open door policy and put some missiles in Cuba. Well, that wasn't going to stand, right? That was 90 miles from our shore. President Kennedy, bravely faced him down. And the rest is history. Well, this is no different. What's the point? So this war never would have happened. This conflict that's going on was utterly unnecessary. And now the enormous damage that's going to occur to the American economy and the global economy as a result of these massive, unthinking attacks on the global trading and finance system are really we're going to reap the whirlwind that we're sowing at the moment.
Yeah, well, you know what they'll say, David. I can almost turn on any, including Fox, I can turn on any major network, and what they'll counter what you just said with, yes, but Putin wants to take back the Soviet Empire. He wants to have all those countries back in his fold again. And if we give in to the Ukraine, he's going to go to Poland, and he's going to go to all the other ones, and he's going to just take them right back into the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I know that.
That's the
I
propaganda.
see it myself on Fox. Other than, frankly, Tucker Carlson, who's got his head screwed on right, but he's like the odd man out at Fox. The rest of them are blithering idiots. They're just as bad as MSNBC or CNN. But the fact is, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Secondly, I think Putin has proved himself to be no saint of men for sure over the last 25 years, but he is about as smart and as prudent and as cautious as they come. And there is no Russian leader who wants to retake Poland, in his right mind. The Poles hate the Russians hate the Poles. There's not a chance in the chance in the world that they would want to retake Poland, or for that matter, Lithuania, or any of the rest of them. That's just made up. It's off the seat of the pants. There's no evidence for that. On the other hand, have these people done any historic research? And I had some of it in my article.
Yes, you did. Yes,
you kindly cited. But the fact is, Ukraine has never been a real country until 1922, when Lenin and then Stalin and Khrushchev made it a country by detaching parts of Russia, putting it into an administrative appendage that they called the Ukraine, as a matter of how you govern the great Soviet Empire. It had nothing to do with historic boundaries or a real nation state or a state that had survived. In fact, look at the map of 1900. There's no country called Ukraine on it, or for that matter, 1800 or 1700 or 1600, or as far back as you want to go. So what we're basically doing is defending the sacred borders that were created over time by Russian czars and then communist dictators. I mean, have these people thought about the irony of, what they're involved in? Furthermore, if you look at a map of the Ukraine today, in fact, the battle that's going on right now, the eastern part, the Donbass, going down to Crimea, has never been a country called Ukraine. For the last 3.5 centuries, it's been part of Russia, for crying out loud. All that territory was Russian. And it was, either taken by war by earlier czars, or it was purchased from the Turks, who needed cash, by Catherine the Great and others. So the idea that somehow we're defending, the sacred borders of a country that, makes any difference to anybody is just nonsense. And the truth is, this could have been solved just like Yugoslavia was solved. It could have been broken up into a lot of pieces and let the western part go and become Ukraine. Let the eastern part be New Russia, or whatever they want to call it, the Donbass or the republics. And this problem could have been solved long ago. Partition is always the answer when people can't get along. Now, you can look at the election results from Zelensky's last election, where he was actually, in any event, this is just rank nonsense. It's a insult to intelligent life. And it's all because of what I would call wag the dog 2.0. In other words, there's a new poll out today. Biden's approval rating is now 37%. It's plunged by more than any president in modern time, and only is surpassed by Nixon's crash in 1973, when the Watergate was unfolding. Right. So they needed a distraction. And the problem is, if you remember the Wag the Dog movie, at least that was a movie. That was a make pretend. This is real, hot war. This is real live fire action that is totally unnecessary, but I believe provoked by a careless White House that is desperately in need of changing, the venue, changing the topic, because they're in such desperate shape with the American public.
Well, I wonder, though, David, if there might not be, you and I have talked about this before, Eisenhower's warnings about the military-industrial complex. And I'm just wondering, in 2014, you just alluded to it a moment ago, how we became involved in unseating the elected leader of the Ukraine, I believe, in 2014, right?
That's correct.
I mean, that was, and in this article, you mention a young scholar named Lindsay O'Rourke, an associate professor at Boston College, who has written a book, I think, Covert Regime Change, America's Secret Cold War. And you had mentioned there was, I think you said earlier, there's something like 70-some instances where the United States tried to involve itself in overturning governments or sometimes overtly going in and taking over governments and so forth. So it's been something we've been doing forever. Of course, Vladimir Putin better not put a couple of ads on Facebook to try to influence our elections, but we can go in with NGOs and billions of dollars and rally people against the leaders if somebody. So this thing is so big, and the military-industrial complex. I mean, it was yesterday I was watching Bloomberg, and they were talking about how several of these big corporations that sell weapons were going to be profiting from Germany spending billions of dollars and sending it to the Ukraine and so forth. So don't you think that this thing is maybe even bigger than Biden? It maybe the Biden administration saw some advantages politically, thought that he could come out with this in good shape somehow. I don't know how they would figure that.
Okay, yes. I mean, you have to look at it in terms of the continuity of the historical stream here. But the fact is, it all goes back to 1991 when the Soviet Union disappeared into the dustbin of history. Yeah. That was when NATO should have been disbanded. Its whole mission was to contain the Soviet Union, a colossus that occupied the better part of the landmass of the world and 465 million people. That was gone. There was no enemy left. But rather than declaring victory and dismantling NATO, the military-industrial complex convinced Clinton and then the Republicans, they were worse, Republican Senate, that the nifty thing to do would be to invite all the former Warsaw Pact nations and the fragments that pieced off from Russia, Soviet Union proper, into NATO. And so there were 16 NATO countries then. It should have gone to 0, but instead the 16 became 30, including, such little midgets as North Macedonia, the last country to join, that has a police force half the size, or has a military half the size of the police force of Philadelphia. This is crazy. But it was all premised on the fact there was still an enemy in the world. No one ever said what it was, but it was obvious that it had to be Russia because everybody else was in the other tent. I mean, this is nuts. So the extension of NATO, first in 1999, when the original three, Romania, Poland, and Czech Republic joined, and then all the rest of them years later. This is what's led to the present moment. We have simply backed Russia into a corner for no reason other than to give the military-industrial complex a target of opposition and a justification. And this is really important here for the massive military budgets that we have today, which are totally unnecessary. Here's a fact that's startling. When Eisenhower gave this famous warning that you mentioned, 1961, military-industrial complex seeking unwanted untoward powers, the defense budget of the United States in today's dollars was $400 billion. Today, our defense budget is $750 billion, and the Soviet Union doesn't even exist. In other words, we should have cut the defense budget by half from 400 to 200, but instead it's nearly doubled because they've added all these NATO countries that then had to weaponize themselves. And now they've created this phony war with, in Ukraine, which is now got the rest of NATO attempting to increase their defense budgets, buy more weapons. This is just one big weapons buying marketing operation that unfortunately has most of the world held hostage because, after all, Russia is a nuclear armed country that has as many warheads as we do.
Yeah, well, David, all that, if we had cut our budget, our military budget by that amount and not spent it somewhere else, we would be in a lot better shape today, I suppose, because if you add that up year after year after year, it's big money, $30 trillion now in total debt. But, I went back and looked at 1980, about the time you became involved in the Reagan administration and thereabouts. The GDP, the debt to GDP, U.S. government debt to GDP was about 32%.
Right.
That's the numbers I'm seeing. And now it's 230%. 230%.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Is it 130%?
It's 130%.
It's 130%. Yeah. So that's and countries start to run into trouble when they get 60% or 90%. They start going downhill really rapidly. So this is how do we get out of this with just a couple of minutes left? How is this going to pan out? And what would be your advice to, say, common folks? Not really rich people that can run away to some hillside in Switzerland, but people that might be worth $500,000 or a couple of $1 million bucks. Or less.
The first thing is the heart of the matter is the Federal Reserve. You never would have 30 trillion of debt if the Fed hadn't monetized it all, because interest rates would have soared long ago, and the Washington politicians would have, responded whether they wanted to or not. That's what I learned in the 70s when I was a congressman. That's what I learned in the early 80s when we were fighting the budget battle. Back then, the Fed was not yet in the monetization business. People understood that if the government big elbows crowded everybody out of the bond market, somebody couldn't get financed, rates would rise, everybody would suffer, and so there was a reasonable level of fiscal prudence. But once the Fed went into the massive monetization business, and remember, the federal balance sheet was 200 billion when Greenspan took over, and now it's 9 trillion. So I would call that monetization with a vengeance. Okay, it took away the whole restraint that kept the fiscal order reasonably functioning and balanced in the United States. The second thing is that it permitted the entire private sector to go nuts borrowing money as well. If you go back to your same numbers in 1980, total debt of the world, of the United States, public and private, was 5 trillion. GDP was 3 trillion. The ratio was 150%. It had been that for 100 years. Today, total debt, public and private, is 86 trillion. Right? The ratio is 285% of GDP. We're in uncharted waters. Business is saturated with debt. Households are saturated with debt, 17 trillion each. You've mentioned how much the governments have. This is a system that doesn't work. So what should people do? Don't believe a thing that you're told on Bubble Vision. Stay out of the stock and bond markets, because there are disasters waiting to happen. And remember, the only thing that's going to create its value or keep its value in the years ahead is real money, which is gold and silver.
Right. Well, I think we'll leave it go at that, David. We're out of time. Thank you so much for coming on with us. Always a pleasure to have you, to have your insights shared with others, and because they are independent thoughts, and from yourself, a man who's been involved on Wall Street as well as Washington, and we thank you so much for spending time with us.
I might say, Jay, that I write about this every day on David Stockman's Contra Corner.
Absolutely. So people can, and it's a very reasonably priced service too, I might add. The one that I subscribe to anyway is your Contra Corner, David Stockman. Every day, lots and lots of charts and very valuable information. So thank you so much, David, for being with us, and I'd really like to have you back on again sometime soon.
Okay, sounds good.